A tribe in Africa has been claiming a secret for hundreds of years, and scientists just found something in their blood that nobody expected. Before we go further, I want you to sit with that thought for a second. If your own body could speak, if your blood could tell a story your parents never told you, would you want to hear it? Keep that question in your heart, because this story is about to answer it. For generations, there's been a small community living in southern Africa. They look like their African neighbors. They speak African languages. They live in African villages. But they do something no one around them does. They refuse to eat pork. They kill animals a certain way, cutting the throat and letting the blood drain out, just like ancient Jewish law describes. They rest on a special day of the week, separate from their farming and their work. They circumcise their baby boys on the 8th day, and when you ask them who they are, they don't hesitate. They say, "We are Jews. We have always been Jews." This group is called the Lemba, and for hundreds of years, almost nobody outside of Africa believed them. Think about that for a moment. Imagine knowing something about your own identity so deeply, so certainly, that it lives in your prayers, your food, your marriages, your funerals, and then imagine the entire outside world looking at you and saying, "No, that's just a story. That's just a legend. That's not real." That is exactly what happened to the Lemba people for centuries. European travelers who visited southern Africa in the 1800s wrote about them with confusion. These explorers saw a black African tribe practicing customs that looked strangely similar to Judaism. And instead of taking the Lemba's own explanation seriously, many of these outsiders invented their own theories. Some said the Lemba must have copied these customs from Arab traders. Some said it was pure coincidence. Some said it was nonsense, an African tribe simply telling tall tales to seem important. For a long time, the loudest voices in the world refused to believe that a black African community could carry Jewish ancestry. It didn't fit the picture that many people had in their heads about who Jewish people were supposed to look like. But the Lemba never stopped saying it. Grandmother to mother, father to son, generation after generation, they passed down the same story. Long ago, our ancestors came from a place called Sina. They crossed the sea. They came from the north. They were led by a man. And somewhere along that journey, across centuries, across intermarriage, across migration, they settled in southern Africa and became who they are today. It sounds almost like a myth, doesn't it? A story so old, so specific, and yet so hard to prove. For a long time, that's exactly what most people believed it was. A myth, a beautiful story, maybe even a proud one, but not something you could hold in your hands, not something you could measure. And then science entered the picture. If you're feeling that quiet chill right now, that feeling of a mystery about to crack open, don't scroll past it. Stay with this story, because what scientists found next shocked even the researchers themselves. In the late 20th century, a new kind of tool became available to historians and anthropologists: genetics. Scientists realized they could look inside human DNA and trace patterns that had been passed down for thousands of years, hidden in blood, invisible to the eye, but permanent, unchangeable, honest. One of the most powerful tools they used involves something called the Y-chromosome. This is the part of DNA passed almost unchanged from father to son, generation after generation. It rarely mixes or blends the way other DNA does. It's like a stamp, quietly copied down through a direct mail line for thousands of years. And there's one very specific genetic pattern on this Y chromosome that has become famous among scientists. It's called the Cohen modal haplotype. Here's why that name matters. In Jewish tradition, there's a group called the Cohenim. According to ancient belief, the Cohenim descend directly from one man, a priestly line going back thousands of years all the way to the biblical figure Aaron. For centuries, Jewish families with the surname Cohen, or similar versions of that name, have passed down the belief that they come from this priestly bloodline. When scientists studied the Y chromosomes of Jewish men who identified as Kohanim from different parts of the world, from Europe, from the Middle East, from communities that had been separated for over 1,000 years, something remarkable showed up. A shared genetic pattern, appearing again and again, far more often among Kohanim than among other groups. It was one of the first times science seemed to actually detect an ancient family line that religious tradition had been describing for centuries. Now here's where the story turns toward the Lemba. Researchers began testing Lemba men. They wanted to know, does this same ancient genetic pattern exist in their blood too? And in a discovery that stunned many people, especially those who had spent generations doubting the Lemba story, the answer came back yes. A notable number of Lemba men, especially those from a specific priestly clan within their community called the Buba clan, carried that same Cohen modal haplotype, the same ancient genetic fingerprint found in Jewish priestly lines thousands of miles away. Take a second and really feel the weight of that. For hundreds of years, a black African community had been telling the world our ancestors came from the north, we carry a priestly bloodline, we are connected to ancient Israel. And for hundreds of years, much of the world had brushed that claim aside as folklore. Then science looked inside their blood, and the blood agreed with the grandmothers. If this is giving you chills, imagine how it felt for the Lemba elders who had spent their entire lives defending a truth nobody wanted to hear. Take a moment right now and just whisper the word truth if this story is starting to move you, because we are only getting started. Now, before we go further, it's important to slow down and be honest about something. Science is powerful, but science is also careful. It doesn't deal in fairy tale endings. It deals in evidence, probability, and patterns. So let's talk about what this discovery actually means and what it doesn't mean. The presence of the Cohen modal haplotype in Lemba men does not prove that every single Lemba person today is a direct, unbroken descendant of ancient Israelites. Genetics is complicated. A shared genetic marker can travel through migration, trade, conquest, and mixing between many different populations over thousands of years. Some researchers point out that this particular genetic pattern has also shown up at lower frequencies in other populations across the Middle East. In parts of Africa, not only among people who identify as Jewish. So scientists have to ask harder questions. Did this genetic marker arrive in the Lemba community directly from ancient Israelite ancestors? Or did it arrive indirectly, carried by Arab traders or by other Semitic peoples who traveled and settled along the East African coast over the centuries? Peoples who themselves may have shared distant ancestry with ancient Israelites long before reaching Africa? This is where historians and geneticists still debate. And honestly, that debate is part of what makes this story so alive. It's not closed. It's not finished. It's not a simple yes or no. But here's what makes this discovery still remarkable, even with all that uncertainty. The Lemba's own oral history, passed down for generations without any access to modern genetic science, pointed toward a very specific kind of story. A migration from the north, a journey across water, a priestly class within their own society, a group they call the Buba, who are seen as spiritually important, who lead certain rituals, who are treated with a special kind of respect within Lemba culture. And when scientists tested that very clan, the Buba clan specifically, the genetic signal was even stronger. Think about that. The Lemba didn't just say we might have foreign ancestors. They said there's a specific group among us, a specific bloodline that carries something sacred. And when science zoomed in on exactly that bloodline, the evidence lined up in a way that stunned researchers. It's one thing for an old story to be vague. It's another thing for an old story to be specific, detailed, and structured, and then have science confirm the shape of that structure, even if it can't confirm every single detail. This is the kind of moment that changes how we think about oral history altogether. For centuries, so-called experts assumed that stories passed down by mouth, especially by African communities without written records, were unreliable. Myths, legends, things to be entertained by, not trusted. But the Lemba story forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. How many other oral histories, from how many other communities around the world, have been dismissed the same way, simply because nobody had the tools yet to check if they were true? If that question is sitting heavy in your chest right now, you're not alone. Let that feeling stay with you for a moment, because we're about to go even deeper into where this story actually began, thousands of years before any DNA test existed. Let's step back in time and imagine the world differently. Long before modern borders, before ships had engines, before maps were accurate, there were ancient trade routes running along the coast of East Africa. Merchants moved goods, and sometimes people moved with them. Some historians believe that a group of Semitic traders, possibly from the region of Yemen or nearby areas, settled along parts of the East African coast many centuries ago. Lemba oral tradition speaks of a place called Sina. To this day, nobody has definitively agreed on exactly where Sina was. Some believe it might refer to a location in Yemen. Others connect it to a place along the East African coast itself. This uncertainty isn't a weakness in the story. It's actually very typical of how ancient oral histories work. Place names shift. Meanings blur across centuries. What stays constant isn't always the exact geography, but the emotional core of the memory. We came from somewhere else. We crossed water. We carried something sacred with us. According to Lemba tradition, their ancestors eventually made their way south into Africa, intermarrying with local populations. Along the way, and eventually settling in areas that are now part of Zimbabwe and South Africa. Over the centuries, their outward appearance blended completely with the African communities around them. Their language shifted to local Bantu languages. Their daily life became fully African in almost every visible way. But something didn't fully disappear. The dietary laws stayed. The refusal to eat pork stayed. The specific method of slaughtering animals stayed. The importance of male circumcision on a specific timeline stayed. The idea of a priestly clan among them stayed. The belief that they were, in some deep and ancient way, different from their neighbors, connected to a distant ancestor in a distant land, stayed. For a community to preserve that level of detail across dozens of generations, without any written scripture of their own to remind them, is extraordinary. It tells you something about how seriously they treated this memory. It wasn't just a fun bedtime story, it was identity. It was survival of a truth they refused to let die, even when nobody outside their community was listening. Now, here's where the story becomes even more emotional. For centuries, being seen as different in southern Africa, especially different in a way connected to Judaism, was not exactly safe or comfortable. During periods of European colonization, and later, during the apartheid era in South Africa, identity was a dangerous and complicated thing. People were sorted, labeled, and judged based on race and origin, often violently. Imagine belonging to a community that felt, deep in their bones, connected to Jewish heritage while living in a world that didn't fit them neatly into any of its rigid categories. Not fully seen as Jewish by many Jewish communities abroad because of skin color and geography. Not fully understood by their African neighbors because of their strange dietary laws and rituals. Caught in between two worlds, defending a truth that almost nobody validated. That is not just a historical curiosity. That is generations of quiet, emotional weight, carried by real families, real grandparents, real children who grew up hearing, "We are Jews," while the rest of the world looked at them with doubt or confusion. So when genetic science finally arrived and finally offered even partial support for what they had always claimed, it wasn't just an academic discovery. For many Lemba people, it was validation. It was the feeling of finally being believed. If you've ever had a truth about yourself that nobody else wanted to accept, you already understand exactly what that must have felt like. Let this next part sit with you for a second before we continue. And if the story is touching something in you, drop a single word in the comments right now, just one word, the word that describes how this part of the story makes you feel. Then let's keep going, because there's still more beneath the surface. Now let's talk about the Buba clan a little more closely, because this is one of the most fascinating threads in the entire mystery. Within Lemba society, the Buba clan holds a special status. They're often seen as a kind of priestly class. Certain rituals, especially those involving animal slaughter, are traditionally reserved for members of this clan. Other Lemba families are expected to bring their animals to a Buba clan member to be killed properly, following the specific method their laws require. This structure is strikingly similar to the ancient priestly system described in Jewish tradition, where the Kohanim, the priestly descendants of Aaron, held specific ritual responsibilities that ordinary members of the community did not perform themselves. When researchers specifically studied the Y-chromosome patterns within the Buba clan, the presence of that Cohen modal haplotype pattern appeared at a notably higher rate compared to other Lemba clans. In other words, the very group that Lemba culture treats as spiritually special showed the strongest genetic echo of that ancient Middle Eastern priestly signature. This is the kind of detail that makes scientists pause. Coincidences happen in research all the time, but when a community's internal social structure, something they organized on their own, based purely on inherited tradition, lines up this closely with a modern genetic pattern discovered completely independently, it becomes much harder to wave away as random chance. It doesn't answer every question. It doesn't hand us a perfect, tidy conclusion wrapped in a bow, but it adds another layer to a mystery that keeps getting more complex and somehow more convincing the deeper you look. Now, let's talk honestly about the debate that still exists today, because a good mystery deserves an honest ending, not a fake one. Not every scientist agrees on exactly how to interpret the Lemba's genetic results. Some researchers argue the evidence strongly supports a real ancient connection to Jewish or broader Semitic ancestry, likely through Yemeni or Southern Arabian traders who intermarried with local African populations many centuries ago. Others are more cautious, pointing out that genetic markers can travel through many different paths over thousands of years, and that the presence of a shared marker doesn't automatically mean identical origin stories. There's also a deeper, more philosophical debate hiding underneath the genetic one. What actually makes someone Jewish? Is it purely genetics? Is it religious practice? Is it community acceptance? Is it lived tradition passed through generations? Different Jewish communities and religious authorities around the world have different answers to that question, and the Lemba story sits right in the middle of that unresolved conversation. Some Jewish religious authorities have shown interest in engaging with the Lemba community and their history. Some Lemba individuals have pursued formal recognition or even religious conversion processes to solidify their connection to broader Jewish religious life. Others within the Lemba community feel they don't need outside permission at all. They already know who they are. They've known for centuries. The DNA didn't create their identity. It simply gave the outside world a language it finally understood. That distinction matters. The Lemba weren't waiting for a lab result to tell them their history. Their history was already alive, already spoken, already lived every single day through their customs. The science didn't invent their identity out of nothing. It simply opened a door that let more of the world finally listen. If you've made it this far into the story, take a breath, because we're heading into the final part now, the part where all of these threads come together into something much bigger than one tribe, one DNA test, or one country. Let's zoom out for a moment. The story of the Lemba isn't just about one community in southern Africa. It's a mirror held up to a much larger, much older human habit. The habit of deciding, often without any real evidence, who gets to belong to a story and who doesn't. For centuries, the world quietly assumed that African identity and Jewish identity couldn't overlap in a meaningful way. That assumption wasn't based on careful research. It was based on outdated ideas about race, appearance, and geography. It was based on people deciding, often from a place of ignorance, what history was allowed to look like. The Lemba's DNA didn't just answer a scientific question. It challenged a much deeper, much older prejudice. It forced historians, scientists, and ordinary people around the world to admit something uncomfortable. Human history has never been as clean, as separated, or as simple as our modern categories like to pretend. People moved, people mixed. People carried stories across oceans and deserts and centuries, long before anyone was writing anything down. Ancient Israelite traders may have walked along African coastlines thousands of years ago, married local women, raised families, and slowly, over dozens of generations, become fully part of the communities around them, while quietly preserving fragments of where they came from. If that's true, even partially. True, it means the story of Jewish history and the story of African history are far more intertwined than most textbooks ever taught us. It means identity isn't always about pure bloodlines drawn in neat straight lines. Sometimes it's about memory, about what a community chooses to protect, generation after generation, even when the rest of the world refuses to believe them. Think about what it must have felt like for a Lemba grandmother, decades ago, teaching her grandchildren the old dietary laws, the old rituals, the old stories about Sina and the journey south, never once seeing any scientific proof, never once knowing if the world would ever believe her. She kept the story alive anyway, not because she needed proof, but because it was true to her ancestors, true enough to protect at any cost. That is the real heart of this mystery. Not a lab, not a chromosome, not a scientific paper. A grandmother's stubborn love for a truth nobody else wanted to hear. And now, generations later, science has finally caught up to her. So here is the real question this story leaves behind. Long after the DNA results, long after the debates among scientists, long after the headlines fade away, how many other truths are out there right now, quietly passed down in villages, in families, in communities the world has never taken seriously, simply waiting for science, or simply for someone willing to listen to finally catch up? Maybe the biggest mystery here isn't really about the Lemba at all. Maybe it's about how much of human history has been dismissed, not because it was false, but because the people telling it didn't look the way the world expected the truth to look. And maybe, just maybe, the real lesson of this story is one worth carrying with you long after this video ends. Sometimes, the loudest truths in this world are not shouted from powerful places. Sometimes they are whispered quietly from grandmother to grandchild for hundreds of years, waiting patiently for someone, somewhere, to finally say, "We believe you."